All right, wrapping up Enemies of the State of Marriage with the big grand finale today.
What could it be?
Let's get into that. Before we get into today's episode, just wanted to remind you that in the description of the video below, we put links to all of our social media accounts.
You can always reach us with questions or comments about this episode at marriagebydesignpodcast@gmail.com.
And finally, if you want to support us financially, there is a link to be able to do so at the end of each of the descriptions of our videos. Now, let's get back to the show. Hi, everyone. I'm Nathan Warnock.
I'm Andrea Warnock, and you've joined us for Marriage by Design. This is a time where we get to talk to you about God's design for marriage, what the Bible has to say about that, and how we live that out practically.
That's right. So we've been on a journey over the last several weeks talking about enemies of the state of marriage. And we've talked about Hollywood, and we've talked about reality TV, and we've talked about
Social
Christian
media.
organizations, social media. We've talked about a number of things that certainly at times, sadly, are enemies of your marriage specifically. They're trying to redefine what marriage looks like, what you think of marriage, and so many marriages get victimized by these enemies, and many of them end up crashing down completely or ending in divorce or other kinds of craziness. But what we want to talk about today is really, it is the one ring to rule them all when it comes to enemies of your marriage. But it also, admittedly, is the most difficult one for us to wrap our heads around. And so our episode today is going to be challenging. It certainly is challenging for us, and it's something that we don't get right oftentimes in our own marriage, and it causes chaos within Andrea and my marriage. And that is the enemy of the state of marriage, me.
Not specifically you.
No, yeah, just every you. I mean, you,
Yourselves. Yeah.
Andrea.
I was
Like,
just saying it's not that Nathan is the
myself.
problem.
Like, yeah, we talked about like enemy of the state of marriage, you, but that's kind of the like. I want to make sure you understand, and everyone understands that you are the problem in your marriage, and your spouse is the problem in your marriage themselves. Like, and really, I guess the way to understand this isn't by saying you're the problem. It's by saying
It's me. Hi.
the
I'm the
me,
problem. It's me.
the me attitude is the problem in all of the ways that it shows up in our lives. And so when we really take a look at, man, as so many people do, they go, man, I really want to have a marriage that is life-giving, that is God-honoring, that is romantic, that is alluring, that is attractive to other people. And yet, why do so many people not have that? Because the answer to getting to that is so incredibly difficult. And is a full-time is really a full-time gig in and of itself, and it's uncomfortable, and it's not really something that you and your spouse can help each other figure out, at least not initially. For some marriages out there that are really at a high level of intimacy, maybe you can, where you can point out like, hey, you're getting in the way of our marriage. Again, the you mentality. And man, God bless you if you're at that place, because most of the rest of us can really struggle with this, and even like recognizing this and accepting it, because it's one thing to recognize like, hey, I'm the problem. It's another thing to go, what, I need to fix that, and not begin to shift the focus to someone else. So, babe, I'll let you kind of lead off. So when we take a look at the way we think about marriage. And unlike when we think about Hollywood or social media or some of these other things where we're going, well, there's someone outside trying to influence you. The thing that makes this one really difficult is there's someone inside you trying to influence you.
Right.
And for the Christian in particular, I've shared this before on this channel. I've shared it with anyone I've had an opportunity to disciple in their spiritual walk. To submit our lives to Christ is to agree to and sign up for a civil war that you will fight for the rest of your life within yourself. Because submission to Christ submits your spirit to him, that eternal part of you that God put inside of you, that it is to submit that to the Lord, for that to be born again, to cross over from death to life, right? But our flesh is our flesh. And it is trapped in this sinful container that I have, that my spirit is also stuck in until such time as the Lord calls my spirit home through death, or the rapture if we're around when that happens. So for me, I have this fleshly part of me that at the end of the day is most interested in me. It's that carnal part of us, that animalistic part of us that's really most concerned with our own survival at a most basic level. And then above that, our own emotional pleasure, right? Being happiness or, joy, feeling good, however you would describe the part of you that's like, man, these are the things that I want. And so as we recognize we're in this civil war, how do you further define that? Like, what's the Bible? You shared some verses with me that you were like, man, this really
right.
I think is insightful as we think about attacking this civil war. And then once you share those, let's talk a little bit about how this actually affects our marriages.
Sure. So yeah, there's definitely a war going on constantly of our flesh and our spirit, which is being renewed, always being renewed by the Lord, but our flesh is wanting to take over that, and but yet we need to allow the Lord to renew our hearts constantly, so that we're growing more in Christ, and that battle is a hard battle. And I think it's funny because I was talking to somebody this week about kind of growing in over the years with growing with the Lord. And this person was saying, it gets easier because the sins that you deal with when you're younger just aren't the same as when you get older, And I was thinking afterwards, I kind of was thinking about that and thinking, that's true. I don't deal with the same sins as when I was younger, but I feel like I'm more aware of my sinful nature the older that I get, and the harder it is for me to grapple with that I'm so sinful, and that I'll never overcome this in this life. And I think it's actually a harder battle to fight the older that I get, because I'm just so aware of my selfishness and my sin nature, and it's less okay with me as when I was younger. So anyway, I think that's probably a good thing, but yeah. So some of the verses that I was thinking of is, Jeremiah 17 talks about that our heart in Jeremiah 17:9, our heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. Who can understand it? And I think we have to understand that our sin nature is sick and it's dying, right? It's a deathly part of us wanting to bring death, and it's the dying part of us. It's the part that will not carry on into eternity. Praise the Lord. And it is deceptive, and it's sick, and it's something that we're always warring with. And so I think remembering that, there's a part of me that's not right. Like it's not, there's a part of me that isn't right. And so I have to always be looking at, okay, am I keeping that is that what's going on here with this problem? Is it me? And is it something that needs to be brought to the obedience of Christ? So then to that, 2 Corinthians 10:5 said, the very last part of it says to take every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. And there's so many, I think that's really what, what I deal with more as I get older is like, oh, all these, there's so many thoughts that I'm like, that's not a thought that's of the Lord. And choosing to say like that needs to be brought to the Lord and renewed. Right. So, and certainly in my marriage, I think that's more so, if marriage is supposed to be a picture of Christ's relationship with the church, it's probably going to be the relationship that's the hardest and the one that is attacked the most and the one that you're constantly having to deal with struggles in the most. And so, I think that's one thing that I find security in our marriage is that we both understand that. And so in those times where we're really struggling, there's kind of a security of like, we both understand that we're both desiring to do this God's way, even when it's hard and we're not giving up on each other. But yeah, there's probably a selfish person or two, like somebody who's dealing with, their own self-seeking attitude or something like that. That's the problem. And so,
which is all of us at times.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, you were saying I'm the problem, and it's not only, it's not just like, I'm thinking about myself. It may be that I'm thinking too much about Nathan. It may be that I'm thinking too much about how he's the problem.
Right. And
so it's like this. It's this. Yeah. So is it really that you're thinking you're selfish and you're thinking too much about yourself and what you deserve and how good you are or whatever? Or is it that you're thinking too much about the other person and
that's a good point.
What they're, putting the blame on them?
Yeah, I was kind of thinking of those two as the same thing, but I think you're right. Like
you can really be thinking too much of yourself or the other person or both.
Right. And so often the more time we're spending thinking about how the other person's the problem is time we're not spending thinking about, well, how am I not right?
Yeah.
Like, even in this situation, is there something that I'm, not doing that I ought to be doing?
Right. And that's not to say, I don't want to sit here and say like, oh, your spouse never has issues or your spouse is never the issue in your marriage. But the reality is you can't do anything you can pray for them, of course, and bring the issue up, but you can't make them change. You can't make your spouse be what you think you need them to be, or you can't require that they check these boxes or whatever. Like they are their own person and you have to bear with them in love.
Yeah. I mean, I don't even know that that's something we're called to do in marriage.
What?
Be concerned about whether our spouse is doing what they ought to be doing or not. Like, I think our spouse can be doing wrong. Mm-hmm. And certainly, that isn't right for them to be doing that.
Yeah. I think you should. That's something that's fair to bring up to them and try to deal with that, deal with.
Yeah. I'm not talking about that we ought to ignore that. I'm just saying that I don't know that impacts my responsibility in my marriage.
Right. Sure.
Like, but is that not 90% of the marital problems that we see out there?
Of course.
It's not. The actual problem isn't that my, wife sits on social media all day. The real problem is my wife sits on social media all day and I deserve something other than that. And I that's the part that I think we need to cut out. I mean, for one thing, as Christians, Christian means Christ-like.
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember any stories in the Gospels where Jesus went, yeah, I'd really like to do that thing, but you see how they treated me? Like, now there were times when Jesus, and the temple specifically, he'd go and teach the temple, and they would cast him out, and he would leave. And then the next town, he'd go right to the temple, and then they'd cast him out, and then he would leave and speak to the people, which obviously is not a perfect picture because Jesus wasn't married to the temple. But he never, his people, the bride, the people he was ministering to, there was never any like, well, I'd like to act this way, but did you see how they acted?
Mm-hmm.
Like that, it was him giving of himself.
Yeah.
And certainly, like with the woman in the well, that woman at the well, he told her, like, you're what you're doing here is not right. But he didn't follow her back to town to make sure that she dumped the boyfriend, quit living with the guy.
Right.
He didn't do any of that. He said, hey, this thing you're doing is wrong. I wish you'd stop doing it because it's going to hurt you.
Yeah.
And then he bounced to the next thing because he had responsibilities.
Yep.
I mean, I think probably a lot of people would say what they see in marriages around them and maybe in their own marriages, like, hey, this thing you're doing is not right. In 10 minutes, I'm going to see if it's fixed, or I'm going to talk to you about it again. And then tomorrow morning, and then tomorrow afternoon, and then a week from tomorrow, and on 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 and on.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like we have a personal responsibility to make sure that our spouse gets right.
Yeah.
And the reality of the matter is, what you said is perfectly right. It's great, and I do think it's being a good steward of our marriage to go, hey, this thing you're doing, I'm not sure that's right. What do you think about that? And then prayer is probably our primary thing. But man, I can't tell you how many spouses or how many couples we sit down with where he's mad that she's doing this, so he does this. She's mad that he's doing that same thing, so she continues to do this. And the only thing, the thing that would fix that marriage could be fixed right now. He just needs to stop doing that, and she needs to stop doing that. That's it. Not because the other person's doing it. Like, no, there's so many couples that are in a Mexican standoff where they're both waiting for the other person to do the right thing.
And if they would both
just
do
the
mature
right
thing.
Well, yeah, just do the right thing. Like, forget the mature thing. Just do the right thing.
Yeah.
Like, I like the love and respect thing where he says the most mature person does the thing. Except the problem is sometimes I feel like that feeds the problem. Because then in my own mind, I'm going, hey, no problem. I'll just do what I'm supposed to do over here because I'm better than you. Because I'm the mature one. That actually creates a deeper rift between you and I because now I've made a judgment about my value in comparison to you. Like, I was the one that jumped off the crazy cycle because I'm better than you. And someday you'll be like I am and mature. But right now you're not. You're just a little immature person.
Yeah.
And it leads to this sort of condescension.
Yeah, I can see that.
Instead of, and this is like the thing that I want you to take away, because I think probably all of us have had those moments in our own marriage, probably. And if you haven't, if you have no idea what we're talking about and you've been married, like for longer than a week, you should email me and tell me all your secrets. But I think most people would say, hey, I've recognized where I get so sideways in my marriage because all I can think about is what I deserve that my spouse won't give me, or the thing my spouse is doing that they shouldn't be doing, and how much it bothers me. And the temptation is always to withhold something we know we ought to be doing because to try and manipulate, even if you're not thinking like, okay, I'm going to do this and it's going to make them do this. It's just a natural reaction to like, hey, in marriage, there's two parties. You do your thing. I do my thing. When you don't do your thing, there's just this sort of temptation that creeps in to not do my thing, right? Because you're not doing your thing. Like, this was the deal. You do yours, I do mine. And so here's the challenge that I want to lay before you. And I'm not telling you it's easy, but I'm telling you it will absolutely revolutionize your marriage.
It'll revolutionize your heart.
Right. Yeah, and that's, you kind of gave it away, cuz really what we're talking about here is this is the moment where our relationship with God becomes one with our relationship with our spouse, which was the design, right? When you read Paul's description of marriage in Ephesians 5, he equates marriage with our relationship with God directly, right? Wives, submit to your husbands. Why? Because that's what we do here as Christians. Like, I'm a wife of Christ. That's my role as a Christian. I am a part of the wife of Christ. So what do? I submit to God.
Mm-hmm.
As Christ sacrificed for the church, Christ didn't ask questions about his sacrifice except to God. And obviously, infamously, is the time in the garden before he went to the cross.
Right.
But even that clearly was him asking, Lord, if there's another way. But it was never, he didn't even leave it at that. Like, I would have been tempted to be like, God, if there's any other way, show me. Like any time.
Like
right just
now.
You can show me like right now. Like, if I cough in the next 5 seconds, I'll know it's not your right. I mean, it turns into this negotiating, right? Like a lot of our prayer. I mean, that's not what he said. He said, Lord, if there's any other way, but not my will, but yours be done. Because he was a servant to the bride, to us, to the people, to the children of God. He had no business being our servant, but he was. How? Like, how did Jesus do that? I mean, Jesus knew all that. Jesus was there at creation. John 1:1 makes that clear. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Jesus was there. He saw what happened in the Old Testament. He saw how often people committed adultery on God through idolatry, did sexual craziness. David hooked up with some chick and then had her husband killed, and all kinds of craziness. I mean, they're throughout the Old Testament, it's people just doing nothing but sticking the Father of Jesus in the back. Yet Jesus comes down to earth, spends the entirety of his life. Now we get to see his ministry from 30 to 33 years old, but presumably spent his entire life serving people, the very people who had the heart that stuck God in the back for thousands of years before that, and then willingly had the crap beat out of him and was hung naked on a cross so that we could be joined to God. And I go through that specifically because for me, and I hope for you, it helps us to understand that what we're called to as Christians is to be Christ-like. It is to go through, it's to recognize we're sanctified by God, meaning we're set aside for his purposes. And his purpose is to minister to his people on his behalf. Which means we're ultimately, as Paul and James and Peter and a number of others describe themselves, we are servants, slaves to Christ. Which means the question is never, what does this other person deserve? It's, what does God deserve? Mm-hmm. And here's the benefit that we have. There's almost no questions about what our spouse deserves. It's really incredible the amount of time God spent in the Bible talking about what marriage was meant to look like. Don't you think? Like, it does seem a little weird that there's like 2 books of the Bible that talk about how church should be structured. 3. And there's verses all over the place about what marriage should look like. So for us, like, that to me is one of the most empowering things for me as a husband, is to get in the Bible and figure out, okay, Lord, what is it that you call me to as a husband? And then to be able to say, okay, now how do I get myself to think, Nathan, you have to be focused on doing these things for the Lord, because that's what the Lord asks you to do. And where Andrea is at with what she's doing really isn't super relevant. It doesn't mean it's not hurtful. It doesn't mean I don't have emotions or feelings. It doesn't even mean she's right or wrong. But what it does mean is that it's not relevant with regards to what am I asked to do for God. Like, as a servant of Christ, what am I asked to do as a husband? And that's super challenging for me. Like, it's super difficult for me because, of course, I'm constantly tempted to tattle on you to God.
Mm-hmm.
Like, yeah, God, I know, but did you see what she's doing? Did you hear what she said to me?
Mm-hmm.
Lord, you know her thoughts. Like, I kind of can do the Job thing. Like, yeah. Lord, I just tell me, like, I deserve an answer as to why I'm getting treated this way, or why we're having this issue, or whatever the thing is. But at the end of the day, like Job, God's there going, no, you don't. You really just have one thing to concern yourself with, and that's righteousness before me.
Mm-hmm.
And does it feel? It feels probably disingenuous to say, "Hey, it's just that easy," because of course, it's incredibly difficult to daily sacrifice ourselves, particularly to the one human being that oftentimes, just reality of the matter is, can drive us the most nuts because they're around us the most.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the hard thing is, just knowing the answer to something doesn't mean that living that out is easy, right?
Right.
Like, just because Nathan and I have a lot of experience with marriage ministry doesn't mean that we've got the perfect marriage, or that we have the advice, but do we always live that out? No, know. So yeah, the words are easy to say, but the actions are hard to do.
Yeah, and in some ways, like being transparent, with us, in some ways that can be an additional challenge for you and I. Because sometimes we're in situations where I'm like, we've taught this.
Oh yeah.
How are you not understanding that? And listen to what I just did. That's the problem.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, instead of just going like, hey, how am I to live with Andrea? With understanding, Peter said it, and forgiveness, Jesus said it. Why? Because that's what we do here. Like, for God, right? So that I'm able to go to my Father and go, God, at the end of the day, I was just yours. And I know I didn't always get treated right, and I know that wasn't right, but I wanted to live in a manner that brought glory and honor to you. Why? Because that's what Jesus did.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to be able to live up to that standard so that I can go to heaven? No. It has nothing to do with that. But because I love him, that's what it means to love God. That word love, man, we throw that around all over the place these days. I've been thinking about this a lot because of the situation one of our kids has been going through. We throw love around, like love, 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 love. Including with God, to God, right? Every prayer, like, Lord, I just love you so much. Do you? Like, do we even really know what that means?
Yeah, I mean, we talk to our kids about, man, I hope that one day you can choose to obey out of love and not obey out of fear of consequence, right, or whatever. Usually it's like fear of consequence or hoping to get what you want or something like that. Like, I hope that you obey out of love because you know that I have your best interest at heart, yep, and you love me and trust me.
Right.
And I think, and that's what I hope for with my relationship with the Lord, and hope that that's the way I live my life, is that, yeah, I'm obedient to the Lord just because I love him and I trust that his way is higher than my way and his thoughts are higher than my thoughts, and that's just the right thing. And his plan is better than my plan,
And it's honestly, and this is really not like a YouTuber plug. Like, this is genuinely what we hope for everyone that listens to this podcast. I don't care when you hear it, who you are, what your background is, and it's the same for every couple we have the privilege of being able to meet with in person. We genuinely desire that you have an understanding of what it means to love your spouse via your love for God.
Yeah.
Like, your love for God is the road by which you love your spouse. And we could probably, and probably should, do a whole series on that, really breaking that down. Like, as we love God, we love our spouse. And the more we pursue our love of God, the less we have to think about loving our spouse.
Mm.
And man, there are so many people, you and I included at times, that spend so much energy and effort trying to figure out how to love our spouse. And we're chasing this little thing over here instead of just doing the thing that will actually deliver that.
Yeah, I think a lot of times the answer to marital issues is really getting your issues with the Lord worked out.
I 100% agree with that.
You know,
couldn't agree more.
Because if you've got a block going on with the Lord, whether that's a bitterness you have towards the Lord or just a heart issue that you haven't let the Lord work out in you, it's going to pour out in your marriage.
Yep.
And it's poisoning your relationships.
Man. Yeah, it is.
Maybe slowly. But
right.
but it's a heart issue, and it's a you issue. It's a me issue.
Right.
And I think it's so important to be looking at, like, flip the script, not what do I deserve, but how can I love the Lord better? And how am I the problem? How can I get that right?
Totally. Yeah, that's good. Thanks, babe. It's good. Well, look, this is certainly something we could talk about way longer than 30 minutes. But I think it really is key. And man, I would challenge you, spend time thinking about this. And for this one, I would encourage you, do it alone. Like, spend some time just quietly reflecting on how much of my time am I really spending thinking about me, or thinking positive things about me or negative things about my spouse.
Mm-hmm.
Because both those sort of revolve around you. And what would my marriage look like if I was willing to lay that down?
Yeah.
Because if you do, your relationship with the Lord will take off, and your spouse will be the beneficiary of that. And man, your marriage will be radically changed. So I hope each of you will think about that this week. Until next week, guys, can't wait to get together with you. Thanks for listening to Marriage by Design. We love having you here. Remember, God is for your marriage.